In the final months of the war, the gates of hell were thrown open across Europe. As Allied soldiers entered the camps, names like Auschwitz and Dachau became permanent scars on the human conscience, their horrors defined by a chilling industrial efficiency. The world was forced to confront a new vocabulary of suffering. Yet, hidden in the Balkans, another system of camps operated with a ferocity that shocked even its Nazi patrons. Within the so-called independent state of Croatia, Jasenovac was more than a center for imprisonment and murder. It was a sprawling laboratory of pain, where the very concept of mechanized killing was replaced by something far more intimate and archaic. Here, the methods were medieval, the violence deeply personal. Entire families were not marched to gas chambers, but were extinguished with handmade tools and blunt instruments. The guards were not just cogs in a machine of extermination, they were artisans of agony, reportedly competing to invent more creative and agonizing ways to kill. In this place, cruelty was not just a means to an end, it was the entire point. From the ashes of a fallen kingdom, a new and terrible state was born. In April of 1941, the military might of Germany and its partners shattered Yugoslavia in a campaign lasting just 11 days. From the ruins, the independent state of Croatia emerged, a puppet regime governed by the fascist Ustaše and their leader Ante Pavelić. For years in exile, they had nursed a venomous dream of Croatian independence, fueled by a deep-seated hatred for Serbs, Jews, and Roma, the very people they now blamed for all of Croatia's past misfortunes. Their program of racial purification was extreme, even by the dark standards of the era. Where Nazi Germany had initially pursued forced emigration and ghettoization before committing to systematic murder, the Ustaše moved immediately to a policy of direct extermination. Their objective was brutally simple: to forge an ethnically pure Croatia by eliminating all who did not belong. Within a nation of 6 million, their calculus of death targeted nearly 2 million Serbs, 40,000 Jews, and 20,000 Roma for annihilation or forced conversion. But the methods they would employ were far more intimate and far more cruel. The centerpiece of this genocidal vision, the Jasenovac camp complex, was established in August of 1941. Situated along the banks of the Sava River, roughly 100 kilometers southeast of Zagreb, its purpose was not merely to kill. It was designed to radiate terror, paralyzing entire communities with fear. Under its first commandant, Ljubo Miloš, Jasenovac developed a character all its own, distinct from the German camps. This place would not rely on gas chambers or mechanized efficiency, but on the cold steel of hand tools, on improvised weapons, and on the direct personal participation of its guards in every act of slaughter. From its very inception, the camp operated on a twisted logic that fused political persecution with ethnic cleansing and sadistic spectacle. Here, guards were not simply following orders, they were actively encouraged to make the process a prolonged and agonizing ritual for their victims. Yet the true architect of Jasenovac's deepest horrors had not yet arrived. When Vjekoslav Luburić assumed command in 1942, he would transform an already brutal facility into a machine of suffering that defied all human comprehension. In the suffocating heat of 1942, a new kind of darkness descended upon Jasenovac. Its architect was Vjekoslav Luburić, a former law student whose years of exile had twisted his intellect into a tool for radical violence, earning him a reputation that unsettled even the most hardened Ustaše veterans. For Luburić, the appointment as commandant was not a duty, but a calling. He envisioned Jasenovac as a laboratory where the very art of human destruction could be perfected. Under his command, a culture of competitive cruelty began to fester, a phenomenon unique among the concentration camps of Europe. Guards were not merely ordered to kill, they were challenged to invent new methods of torture and execution, their grim creativity rewarded with promotions, extra rations, and public acclaim. Mass murder was transformed into a spectator sport. Several times each month, Luburić would stage gruesome competitions to determine which of his men could dispatch the most prisoners before dawn. Fellow guards would gather to watch and cheer as their colleagues vied for prizes and prestige in a theater of slaughter. The most infamous of these contests unfolded on the night of August 29, 1942. On that night, a Franciscan friar turned Ustaše executioner named Peter Brzica claimed the title. Using a curved blade known as a Serbocek, designed for the swift cutting of throats, he personally murdered 1,360 souls. His record would stand unbroken. But Luburić's innovations went far beyond simple contests of killing. He cultivated an environment where torture became an elaborate craft, and medical knowledge was perverted to discover the absolute limits of human endurance. The commandant himself was a direct participant, often spending entire nights in the killing fields, personally selecting prisoners for his elaborate days-long experiments in pain. His involvement was not distant, but deeply, terrifyingly personal. A grotesque economy flourished under his rule, built upon the systematic plunder of the dead and the dying. Gold teeth were pried from the mouths of living prisoners, human hair was harvested for textiles, and body fat was rendered into soap. While such practices occurred in Nazi camps, at Jasenovac they were conducted with a sadistic intimacy that shocked even visiting German officials. The camp's reputation for unrestrained brutality began to echo across occupied Europe. Nazi administrators, themselves architects of genocide, filed reports expressing alarm at the methods employed at Jasenovac. Some German officers even requested their personnel be withdrawn, citing a level of violence that exceeded what they considered acceptable military standards. For Luburić and his followers, however, this condemnation was proof of their success. They had created a place where all moral limits had been abandoned, and the darkest human impulses could be explored without consequence. Here, the machinery of death had a human face. Unlike the industrial anonymity of the gas chamber, which created a psychological chasm between perpetrator and victim, the violence at Jasenovac was intimate and brutally direct. The primary instrument of this slaughter was the Serbocek, a curved knife, once a simple tool for harvesting grain, now refashioned for murder. Its blade was sharpened and attached to a leather glove, allowing the killer to work with chilling speed, his weapon bound securely to his wrist. The mass killings often began as dusk settled over the camp following the evening roll call. Selected prisoners were marched toward the banks of the Sava River, to killing grounds chosen for a grim purpose. The river's swift current offered a ready means of disposing of the dead. From their barracks, other inmates were forced to watch as the Ustaše guards moved down the lines, a methodical procession of terror. This was not killing from a distance, it was face-to-face, each guard forced to look into the eyes of his victim at the very moment of death. This ideology of personal, hands-on ethnic cleansing demanded different methods for different victims. Children, too small for the blade of the Serbocek to be effective, were subjected to unspeakable acts of cruelty. They were beaten against concrete walls, thrown into fires while still alive, or buried in mass graves before their small lives had ended. These were not acts of efficiency, but calculated displays designed to amplify the horror for the adults forced to witness them. Women prisoners endured their own specialized torments, often kept alive for extended periods of abuse. Pregnancy offered no sanctuary. Instead, it became an opportunity for compounded cruelty, with methods devised to extinguish two lives at once. Even in death, the body was used as a weapon of psychological warfare. The disposal of remains became its own form of brutality, as guards dismembered corpses and displayed the parts throughout the camp. Heads were mounted on stakes, organs hung from barrack rafters, and limbs scattered along paths where prisoners had to walk. But perhaps the most disturbing innovation was what the guards called entertainment killing. Murders conducted not for any strategic purpose, but for the sheer amusement of the perpetrators. These grotesque spectacles could last for hours, involving elaborate tortures designed to extract the maximum amount of suffering before the inevitable end. Fellow guards would gather to watch, offering suggestions to refine the techniques of their comrades. The sound of murder became the camp's unending soundtrack. Where gas chambers killed in silence, the methods at Jasenovac filled the air with screams, pleas, and the final rattling breaths of the dying. This acoustic terror was not an unfortunate byproduct. It was a constant, deliberate reminder to the living of the fate that awaited them. For the horrors of Jasenovac were never random. They were part of a meticulously calibrated system where the nature of the violence was tailored to each group of victims, ensuring the deepest possible psychological destruction. The terror at Jasenovac was not a chaotic storm of violence. It was a carefully engineered machine. Within its fences, the Ustaše ideology constructed a complex hierarchy of suffering, where each group of victims faced a distinct and calculated form of persecution, designed to send a chilling message to the world outside. The largest group, the Serbs, were marked for complete obliteration in a fanatical quest for an ethnically pure Croatian state. The violence directed at them was especially ferocious, fueled by a view of Serbs not just as racial inferiors, but as historical rivals. Orthodox priests, the spiritual heart of their communities, were singled out for elaborate rituals of torture, their beards set ablaze, their bodies buried alive in mock ceremonies. The desecration of their faith was as vital to the guards as the extinguishing of their lives. Entire Serbian families were brought into the camp together, turning the deepest human bonds into instruments of unimaginable pain. Guards forced parents to witness the slaughter of their children and compelled siblings to participate in each other's torment. It was a systematic effort to destroy not just individuals, but the very foundation of Serbian identity and memory. For Jewish prisoners, the persecution combined ancient anti-Semitic hatred with a uniquely Croatian cruelty. Unlike in many Nazi camps, they were deliberately mixed with other victim groups, a strategy that allowed guards to exploit ethnic tensions and amplify the suffering. Before they were murdered, wealthy Jewish families were forced to perform in a macabre theater of dispossession, signing over their homes and fortunes to the Ustaše state. It was a ceremony designed to legitimize theft while inflicting a final psychological wound. The Roma people endured a fate that was perhaps the most arbitrary of all. Deemed racially inferior and inherently criminal, they were often used for horrific medical experiments or killed for the slightest infraction. Their vibrant, colorful clothing, a mark of cultural pride, became a target on their backs. In a final act of desecration, guards would force Roma families to perform traditional songs and dances while their loved ones were tortured and killed nearby. Political prisoners, mainly communists, represented an ideological enemy to be broken rather than immediately destroyed. Often kept alive longer than others, they were subjected to relentless interrogations that blended physical torture with psychological warfare, all aimed at shattering their convictions for propaganda purposes. Their survival was merely a prelude to a more insidious form of destruction. Yet, the most depraved expression of this program was a facility known as the Children's House. Established in 1942 for the sole purpose of eliminating children from targeted groups, it was operated by Franciscan nuns who had joined the Ustaše cause. This grotesque perversion of religious charity became a factory of death for children as young as 2. Their murders often staged in full view of adult prisoners. It was the ultimate psychological assault, woven into the very fabric of a system designed to maximize not only death, but despair. The horror was not confined to a single place, but bled across the landscape. Along the winding banks of the Sava River, a sprawling archipelago of death had been constructed. This was Jasenovac. a network of 5 interconnected facilities woven together across 200 square kilometers, each a specialized gear in an integrated machine of terror. The journey into this abyss began at Krapje, the first sub-camp. Here, new arrivals were processed in a brutal ritual of initiation, stripped of their clothes and possessions, their identities assaulted before their bodies. The violence was immediate and deliberate, establishing the suffocating atmosphere of fear that defined the entire complex. Wedding rings were torn from fingers, family photographs ripped from hands, and religious symbols confiscated, severing the last fragile threads connecting prisoners to the world they once knew. From there, many were sent to Jasenovac II at Brokice. This was a work camp where prisoners were forced into grueling agricultural labor under the most unforgiving conditions. The work itself, draining swamps or clearing forests with primitive tools, was not designed for economic output, but as a form of slow execution. Impossible quotas were set, and failure to meet them was a death sentence. Malnutrition, exhaustion, and exposure claimed thousands, their bodies broken long before they reached a designated killing area. The heart of the complex was Jasenovac III, the main camp at Siglana. It was the administrative center and the primary killing facility, housing the headquarters and the workshops where instruments of murder, like the notorious Serbs, were forged. But the production did not stop there. In a display of ghastly alchemy, the workshops processed the remains of the dead. Human hair was woven into textiles, gold teeth melted into ingots, and human fat rendered into soap, forcing living prisoners to commodify the bodies of their fallen comrades. At Jasenovac IV, known as Kojara, this commodification reached its zenith. The camp specialized in leather production, using not only animal hides, but also human skin. Survivors would later testify that guards selected prisoners with unblemished skin for this purpose, their bodies treated as raw material. The finished leather was used to craft gloves, book bindings, and other decorative items for Ustaše officials, a final, horrifying transformation of human life into a luxury good. The 5th camp, Stara Gradiška, was designated for women and children. It contained the infamous children's camp, where thousands of young victims were murdered with methods devised for their small frames. Stara Gradiška also became a laboratory for Ustaše physicians who conducted gruesome medical experiments, testing new killing techniques or studying the effects of prolonged agony purely to satisfy their own perverse curiosities. This entire system was engineered for maximum psychological torment. Loudspeakers broadcast the sounds of torture and execution across the complex, an inescapable soundtrack of suffering. Even transport between the sub-camps in overcrowded cattle cars was an opportunity for more violence. Meticulously detailed records were kept not for bureaucracy, but as trophies, ledgers of cruelty cataloging killing methods and prisoner reactions celebrated as achievements. In a final grotesque twist, the complex included housing for the guards and their families. Children of perpetrators played in yards adjacent to killing fields, and commanders' wives hosted social events within sight of torture chambers. It was a place where the mundane and the monstrous had become one. The evil that took root at Jasenovac did not spring from a void. It wore a human face, belonging not to distant functionaries, but to individuals who actively chose to orchestrate its horrors. The first to arrive were the true believers, men drawn from the ranks of the Ustaše militia who had spent years in exile, their minds steeped in a fanatical vision of racial purity. They came to the camp already committed to its violent purpose, seeing the eradication of others as the necessary price for a new Croatia. But they were not alone. The camp's gates also opened for volunteers with no prior political loyalties, men lured by the promise of unchecked power, stolen wealth, and a license for brutality. It was often these men who, feeling a need to prove their allegiance, descended into the most extreme forms of cruelty. Perhaps most unnerving was the presence of those sworn to God. Several Catholic priests and Franciscan friars joined the camp staff, twisting scripture to provide a sacred justification for slaughter. They created an ideological framework where murder could be perceived as a holy duty, and they did not merely preach this doctrine, they participated in it, their hands stained by the very acts they blessed. One figure embodied this corruption completely, a Franciscan friar named Miroslav Filipović, who would earn the name Brother Satan. During his time as a commandant, he personally took part in the killing of thousands, his religious authority used to assure other guards of divine approval. His very presence sent a terrifying message that even a man sworn to preserve life could become its most proficient destroyer. The web of complicity also ensnared a significant number of women, many of them the wives and relatives of male guards. Their involvement was not peripheral, but central to the machinery of terror, especially in the sections holding female and child prisoners. They developed their own specialized methods of torture, using their gender to gain the trust of vulnerable captives and their knowledge of family bonds to inflict the deepest psychological wounds. Beyond the fences, the local community became entangled in the camp's operations. Farmers and merchants supplied its needs and purchased goods stripped from the dead, creating a grim economic incentive that spread a quiet guilt across the surrounding villages. This created a silent conspiracy, a community of complicity that stretched far beyond the camp's official boundaries. Even the professional classes were represented among the perpetrators. Doctors oversaw medical experiments, lawyers managed the confiscation of property, and teachers designed programs to indoctrinate the children of guards. Within the camp, a unique and sickening culture flourished, one that celebrated creative brutality. Murder was transformed into a form of entertainment, a grotesque social ritual. New guards were initiated through forced participation in killings, a baptism of blood that ensured no one could later claim innocence. This process forged powerful psychological bonds, implicating every man and woman in the camp's crimes. This culture was reinforced by a system of rewards, where promotions and privileges were given to those who showed the most enthusiasm for torture. Guards competed to invent new atrocities, documenting their work in photographs they collected as trophies and shared with their families. Unlike the industrial efficiency of other killing centers, the violence here was deeply personal. The guards were not detached bureaucrats, but intimate participants in every death. And for many, the pride they took in their actions never faded, their voices celebrating the genocide decades after the last prisoner fell. The air itself seemed to change as the Second World War ground toward its conclusion. For the administrators of Jasenovac, the distant thunder of advancing armies was not a sound of liberation, but a final frantic call to erase their sins from the earth. As German forces collapsed across the Balkans, the camp's guards prepared for an evacuation, defined by the same chilling brutality that had governed its entire existence. Unlike the Nazi camp soon to be liberated by Allied armies, Jasenovac was abandoned by its masters in April of 1945, just ahead of the encroaching Yugoslav partisans. But this was no simple retreat. It was a final convulsive spasm of violence, a last-ditch effort to eliminate every witness. Prisoners too frail or sick to march were murdered where they lay, their barracks transformed into tombs. For those deemed strong enough to walk, a new horror began, a death march toward the Austrian border. The guards forced approximately 1,000 prisoners into a staggering column, a procession of living ghosts. The route was deliberately chosen to cut through Croatian villages, a final grotesque display of Ustaše power paraded before the local populace. With every mile, the line of captives grew shorter, as anyone who faltered was cut down without ceremony. Of the 1,000 who started that journey, only a handful would survive to bear witness. Before abandoning the camp, The guards had worked feverishly to destroy the physical evidence of their crimes. Mass graves were unearthed, the bodies of the dead exhumed and set ablaze on colossal pyres. Key buildings were demolished, documents burned to ash, but the sheer scale of the slaughter made complete concealment impossible. When Yugoslav partisans finally entered Jasenovac on May 2, 1945, they found a ruin. The facility was a smoldering wreck, yet it still screamed of mass murder. The killing fields along the Sava River were littered with human remains, and a foul stench clung to the air. The ground itself was gray with the ash of burned corpses, a haunting testament that defied destruction. The evidence they uncovered was staggering. Investigators documented mass graves holding thousands of bodies and rooms piled high with human hair and clothing. They found workshops containing specially designed killing hammers and the notorious Serbs knives, tools that revealed a level of premeditated cruelty that shocked even hardened military men. The few survivors who could speak offered testimony so extreme, so filled with personal hands-on violence, that investigators at first struggled to believe it was true. In the chaotic aftermath of the war, a Yugoslav commission was formed to document these atrocities, but the dawn of the Cold War quickly stifled the pursuit of justice. Key Ustaše leaders and camp commandants had already fled, melting into Western Europe or South America. There, many found protection from Western intelligence agencies. Their knowledge of communist activities in Yugoslavia traded for immunity. Vjekoslav Luburić, the camp's most infamous commandant, found refuge in Spain, living openly under the fascist regime of Francisco Franco. He was never prosecuted, continuing to promote his hateful ideology until his death in 1969. The failure to hold men like him accountable sent a chilling message. With the right political winds, even the most monstrous crimes could go unpunished. While some lower-level guards were captured and tried by the new communist government, these proceedings were often driven more by political consolidation than a genuine quest for justice. The government then imposed a policy of silence, preferring to promote a narrative of ethnic unity rather than confront the depths of the wartime atrocities. This official forgetting prevented a true reckoning with the past and hindered any real commemoration of the victims. The site of Jasenovac was eventually converted into a memorial, but its story was carefully shaped by a political agenda that downplayed the ethnic nature of the genocide. For decades, the camp's horrors remained in relative obscurity, overshadowed by the world's focus on the Holocaust. It was only much later, as classified archives were opened and the last survivors found the courage to speak, that the full terrible scope of what happened at Jasenovac would begin to emerge from the shadows. In the silence that followed the war, a question began to echo across Yugoslavia, a question poisoned by grief and politics. Unlike the meticulous bureaucracy of Nazi death camps, Jasenovac was a place of calculated chaos. Its administrators, anticipating their defeat, ensured that the earth would hold no ledger of their crimes. As partisan forces closed in, guards torched the administrative barracks, turning prisoner registries and official files to ash, leaving a void where history should have been. Into this void, politics rushed in. Early Yugoslav estimates, pieced together from demographic studies and survivor accounts, placed the death toll between 500,000 and 700,000. But these staggering figures soon became ammunition in the ideological battles of the Cold War. Croatian exile groups, many with Ustaše pasts, decried the numbers as communist propaganda, while Serbian nationalists wielded even higher figures, claiming over 1 million dead to justify their own political ambitions. Decades later, modern historical methods would peel back the layers of propaganda. Careful demographic analysis and newly opened archives suggest a more sober truth, a figure between 80,000 and 100,000 victims. Though lower than the early claims, This still marks one of the largest single massacres of civilians in modern European history. The victims reflected the cold arithmetic of the Ustaše racial ideology. Approximately 50,000 Serbs, 20,000 Roma, and 13,000 Jews, alongside thousands of Croatian political opponents. Yet, the true horror of Jasenovac cannot be measured in statistics alone. Its significance lies not just in the quantity of the dead, but in the chillingly personal quality of the violence. The methods were so intimate, so brutal, that they etched themselves onto the memories of entire communities, creating legacies of fear and hatred that would fester for generations. Survivors carried not just numbers, but the faces of their tormentors and the precise details of their crimes. The camp's impact radiated far beyond the individuals it consumed. Whole villages were erased from the map, family lines extinguished forever. The systematic murder of priests, intellectuals, and teachers inflicted a deep cultural wound, a decapitation of community leadership that would take decades to heal. And among the dead were thousands of children, an entire generation stolen, their absence a permanent scar on the demographic landscape. This profound uncertainty over the numbers has left a lasting political poison. To this day, competing statistics are deployed in modern political arguments, preventing a shared historical narrative that might lead to reconciliation. Even the memorial site at Jasenovac has been haunted by these disputes, overshadowing the deeper questions of how such a place could ever exist. The focus on figures has often distracted from the nature of the violence and the social conditions that made it possible. Internationally, the fog of this numbers war has often obscured Jasenovac's significance, leaving it in the shadow of other, better documented sites of the Holocaust. The deliberate destruction of its record stands as a stark lesson that the absence of proof is a weapon for perpetrators, a tool for denial and impunity. It demonstrates how swiftly a society can collapse when moral boundaries erode under the pressure of extremism. Jasenovac reveals how thin the veneer of civilization can be, how quickly it can be torn away by political extremism and ethnic hatred. The failure to bring its perpetrators to justice allowed their toxic ideologies to survive, re-emerging to fuel the conflicts of the 1990s. But even in the deepest darkness, some resisted, risking everything to help others. Their courage is a quiet reminder that moral choice is ever present. To remember Jasenovac is not merely to debate figures, it is to confront the human capacity for evil and to honor the profound importance of vigilance, empathy, and moral courage.